say, Tim Duncan broke his silence, the NBA just witnessed something nobody thought would ever happen. Not a blockbuster trade, not a 7-0 point game, not even another championship celebration, something far bigger. The most private superstar in basketball history just stepped out of the shadows and pointed directly at the future of the league. And that future has a name: Victor Wembanyama. For nearly a decade, Tim Duncan disappeared from the spotlight. No television appearances, no endless podcasts, no daily debates on social media. While former superstars chase headlines, Duncan chose silence. He walked away from the game he dominated and seemed completely content leaving basketball behind forever. That's what made the recent development so shocking. Because when a man who spent 10 years avoiding attention suddenly starts showing up around the Spurs organization again, people notice. When that same man begins speaking publicly about a young player, people listen. And when that player happens to be Victor Wembanyama, the entire basketball world should probably pay attention. Think about this for a second. Tim Duncan played against legends, he battled Hall of Famers, he won championships in multiple eras, he witnessed the rise of Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, Kevin Durant, Stephen Curry, and countless other superstars. Yet, after everything he has seen, after every great player that came before, Duncan is now quietly signaling that something different is happening in San Antonio. Something special. Something the rest of the league might not fully understand yet. Sources close to the Spurs continue to describe Duncan's growing involvement around the organization. Reports suggest he has spent time observing practices, sharing advice, and helping guide the development of the young superstar who has completely transformed the franchise's future. And here's the part that should make every NBA fan stop and think. Duncan never needed to do any of this. He already secured his legacy: 5 championships, 2 MVP awards, 3 Finals MVPs, a Hall of Fame career. Nothing Victor Wembanyama accomplishes can add another trophy to Tim Duncan's collection. So why come back? Why invest time? Why care? The answer may be simpler than anyone realizes. Because greatness recognizes greatness. The moment Wembanyama arrived in San Antonio, something felt different. The expectations were enormous. The pressure was historic. Every camera followed him. Every analyst debated him. Every opposing arena wanted to test him. Most young stars would have struggled under that weight. Instead, Wembanyama embraced it. Game after game, month after month, he began turning impossible expectations into reality. Records started falling, opponents started adjusting entire game plans around him, veterans started talking about him differently, and perhaps most importantly, Spurs legends started paying attention, not because of the highlights, not because of the statistics, but because of the mentality behind them, the hunga. The discipline, the obsession with improvement. Those are the traits that built dynasties in San Antonio. And now many people inside basketball believe they're seeing those same qualities again. But what happened behind closed doors between Wembanyama and the greatest figures in Spurs history may be even more unbelievable than anything happening on the court. Because the story didn't start this season. It started much earlier. And the secret meeting that took place shortly after Victor Wembanyama entered the NBA may have changed the future of basketball forever. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. And if you believe Victor Wembanyama could become the next face of the NBA, hit that subscribe button and type 1" the comment. If you're still not convinced, type 2. Because what happened next completely changed the way Spurs legends viewed Victor Wembanyama. The secret return of Tim Duncan, condensed version. Tim Duncan was never supposed to come back. That is what makes this story so fascinating. When Duncan retired, Benos appeared in a way almost no superstar ever has. No media tour, no constant interviews, no attempts to stay in the spotlight. He simply walked away from basketball and chose a private life. For years, fans believed he was done with the NBA. Then Victor Wembanyama arrived. At first, the signs were subtle. Duncan appeared around the Spurs more often. He watched games. He observed practices. He spent time studying the young phenom who had suddenly become the center of the basketball universe. But this wasn't normal. Duncan has never been impressed by hype. Throughout his career, he ignored headlines and focused only on what truly mattered: discipline, work ethic, consistency, and winning. That's why his growing interest in Wembanyama sent shockwaves through the basketball world. Because Duncan wasn't showing up for publicity, he was showing up because he saw something special, something familiar. The more Wembanyama played, the more he displayed the traits that built the Spurs dynasty: patience, maturity, self-discipline, and an obsession with improving. Those qualities caught Duncan's attention, and once that happened, everything changed. The scary reality for the rest of the NBA is that Wembanyama was already becoming one of the league's most dangerous players. His size, skill set, defensive instincts, and unique versatility were already causing problems for opponents. Now imagine adding Tim Duncan's wisdom to that foundation. Imagine learning playoff basketball from one of the greatest winners in NBA history. Imagine having direct access to lessons that helped build 5 championships. Suddenly, this wasn't just about talent anymore. It was about preparation. It was about legacy. It was about building the next great Spurs era. That's why Duncan's return matters so much. If he believed Wembanyama was merely another talented young player, he could have stayed home. Instead, he got involved. And every appearance sent the same message. The greatest player in Spurs history believes the franchise's future is secure. But Duncan wasn't the only Spurs legend paying attention. Behind closed doors, a private gathering was about to take place. A meeting that would make one thing clear. Victor Wembanyama was no longer just a promising rookie. He was becoming the chosen heir to the Spurs dynasty. The Spurs legends chose their successor, condensed version. Before Victor Wembanyama became the center of the NBA conversation, a quiet moment behind closed doors may have changed everything. Shortly after arriving in San Antonio, Wembanyama sat down with 3 of the biggest legends in Spurs history: Tim Duncan, David Robinson, Manu Ginobili. This wasn't a publicity event. It wasn't a photo opportunity. It was a private conversation between a young superstar and the men who built the Spurs dynasty. For most rookies, that situation would be intimidating. But Wembanyama approached it different. He listened. He asked questions. He absorbed every lesson. The discussion focused on leadership, winning, pressure, and what it truly takes to succeed in the NBA. Afterward, Wembanyama admitted that he learned more about the league during those few hours than at any previous point in his life. That statement alone was revealing, but the reaction from the legends was even more important. Manu Ginobili praised Wembanyama's maturity and professionalism. David Robinson reportedly admired his focus and commitment, and Tim Duncan, a man who rarely gets excited about hype, continued paying close attention. That is what made this meeting so significant. The Spurs legends weren't evaluating his talent. Everyone already knew he was talented. They were evaluating his mindset, and what they saw convinced them that Wembanyama could become something much bigger than a star player. He could become the next cornerstone of the franchise, the next leader, the next face of Spurs basketball. At that moment, the conversation shifted from potential to belief. Because when Hall of Fame champions start investing their time in a young player, it sends a message to the entire basketball world. They see something special. But Wembanyama wasn't satisfied with earning the respect of Spurs legends. Instead, he started building relationships with some of the greatest basketball minds in history. And the group of mentors he assembled would soon become one of the most impressive collections of basketball knowledge ever surrounding a young player. The brotherhood of basketball legends. What makes Victor Wembanyama's rise so terrifying is not only what he can do on the court, it is who is helping him behind the scene. Because once the Spurs legends accepted him, Wembanyama did not stop there. He kept searching. He kept learning. He kept collecting knowledge from players who understood greatness at the highest level. That is where this story becomes almost unfair. Chris Paul entered his orbit and immediately gave him something every young big man dreams of having: elite point guard wisdom. Paul understood angles, timing, patience, and how to control a game without rushing. For Wembanyama, that kind of guidance was priceless. Then came the influence of legendary big men, Hakeem Olajuwon, Kevin Garnett, Tim Duncan. Each represented a different piece of the perfect basketball monster. Hakeem had the footwork, Garnett had the fire, Duncan had the discipline, Chris Paul had the control, and Wembanyama was absorbing all of it. That is what separates him from ordinary young star. Most players want attention. Wembanyama wants information. Most players want praise. Wembanyama wants correction. Most players want to be treated like they have already arrived. Wembanyama acts like he is still building the first version of himself. That mentality is exactly why so many veterans are drawn to him. They do not see a kid chasing fame. They see a rare player who actually wants the truth. And in the NBA, that is uncommon. Because the truth is uncomfortable. The truth tells you your footwork is late. The truth tells you your body is not strong enough yet. The truth tells you your reads are too rushed. The truth tells you highlights mean nothing if you cannot survive a 7-game playoff war. Wembanyama seems willing to hear all of it. That is why this mentor circle matters so much. It is not a publicity campaign. It is not a marketing story. It looks more like basketball's greatest minds quietly handing him the secret codes before the rest of the league can stop it. And that should scare every opponent, because Wembanyama is already physically impossible. Now, he is becoming mentally prepared. He is learning how to think the game through the eyes of champions, defenders, floor generals, and ruthless competitors. That combination is danger. A young superstar with talent is exciting. A young superstar with legendary guidance is a problem. But a young superstar with talent, humility, discipline, and access to Hall of Fame knowledge, That is how dynasties begin. And the strangest part is this: the more Wembanyama learns from the past, the more his own journey begins to look exactly like one of the most legendary Spurs runs ever. The Tim Duncan 1,999 championship run. The Duncan 1,999 parallel. At first, people called it a coincidence. Then they looked closer, and suddenly it stopped feeling like a coincidence at all. Because the deeper basketball fans dug into Victor Wembanyama's playoff run, the more they discovered something almost impossible to ignore. His journey was beginning to mirror Tim Duncan's legendary championship path, not in one way, in several ways. And that's when the comparisons started getting uncomfortable for the rest of the NBA. Back in 1999, a young Tim Duncan carried enormous expectations into the playoffs. The Spurs were building around him. The franchise believed he could become the foundation of a championship era. Fast forward to today, San Antonio once again finds itself built around a young superstar. Once again, expectations are rising. Once again, the future of the franchise appears to rest on the shoulders of a player barely old enough to enter his prime. But the similarities don't stop there. What really caught people's attention was the mentality. Duncan never chased attention. He chased improvement. He wasn't obsessed with becoming famous. He was obsessed with becoming better. And when observers look at Wembanyama, they see many of those same qualities. A player who seems more interested in development than publicity. A player who spends more time talking about growth than personal achievements. A player who appears focused on the process rather than the spotlight. That mindset helped Duncan build one of the greatest careers in basketball history. And now, many believe it could help Wembanyama do the same. The parallels became even more fascinating when former players and analysts began discussing them publicly. Some pointed to the leadership, others pointed to the maturity, others pointed to the way teammates naturally gravitate toward Wembanyama despite his young age. Those traits cannot be measured in a box score, but championship teams recognize them immediately. That's why so many Spurs legends seem unusually confident about his future. They have seen this movie before. Years ago, they watched a quiet young star arrive in San Antonio and slowly transform into one of the greatest winners the sport has ever known. Now they are watching another young star follow a surprisingly similar path. Of course, nobody is saying Wembanyama is already Tim Duncan. That would be unfair. Duncan's legacy was built over nearly 2 decades of excellence. 5 championships, countless playoff battles, years of sacrifice, years of consistency. Wembanyama still has a long road ahead. But what makes this conversation so intriguing is that he appears to be starting from a remarkably similar foundation. Disciplina, humility, work ethic, patience. Those are the qualities that survive pressure. Those are the qualities that survive expectation. And those are the qualities that often separate champions from everyone else. Which leads to a fascinating question. If Wembanyama is already drawing comparisons to a young Tim Duncan, what happens when he reaches his true potential? Because according to people closest to the situation, the version of Victor Wembanyama we're seeing today may only be the beginning. And that possibility is exactly why so many veterans around the league have become believers. Why every veteran believes in Wemby, talent et attention, work ethic earns respect. But obsession changes everything. And that's the word that keeps appearing whenever people close to Victor Wembanyama describe him. Not talented, not gifted, obsessed. Because what separates Wembanyama from many young superstars isn't his height, wingspan, or highlight plays. It's what he does when nobody is watching. Most players spend their off seasons recovering. The great ones spend them improving. Wembanyama seems to spend every available moment searching for another edge, another lesson, another weakness to eliminate, another skill to master. That mentality has caught the attention of veteran players throughout the basketball world. Because experienced players know something younger fans often overlook: talent creates opportunity. Preparation determines what happens next. And Wembanyama prepares differently. Instead of surrounding himself with people who tell him how great he already is, he seeks out people who challenge him, people who have already accomplished what he hopes to achieve. Champion, Hall of Famer, legends. Every conversation becomes a classroom. Every workout becomes an opportunity. Every criticism becomes valuable information. That mindset is incredibly rare, especially for a player receiving as much praise as Wembanyama. Many young stars begin believing their own headline. They start thinking they've arrived. They become comfortable. Comfort is where growth ends. Wembanyama appears to understand that. The more success he experiences, the harder he works. The more attention he receives, the more focused he becomes. The more expectations increase, the more disciplined he appears. Veterans notice those things immediately because they have seen both sides. They have seen talented players waste opportunities. They have seen future superstars lose focus. They have seen careers fall apart because players stopped learning. When they look at Wembanyama, they see the opposite. They see curiosity. They see discipline. They see a player who still behaves like he has everything to prove. That is why so many respected basketball figures continue investing time in him. Not because they are impressed by his highlights, because they are impressed by his approach, and approach is what creates longevity. Approach is what creates champions. Approach is what transforms potential into legacy. The scary part for the rest of the NBA is that Wembanyama is still incredibly young. Most players at his age are trying to figure out who they want to become. Wembanyama already seems to have a clear vision. He wants to learn from the best. He wants to compete against the best. And eventually, he wants to become the best. That level of ambition can be dangerous when combined with elite talent, because once a player develops both the physical tools and the mental foundation required for greatness, progress tends to accelerate. And that's exactly what many veterans believe is happening, right? They don't see a finished product. They see the early stages of something much larger, something that could define the next decade of basketball. But while veteran players were helping shape Wembanyama's game, one voice continued influencing him more than any other. A voice that wasn't always sitting courtside. A voice that wasn't always inside the practice facility. A voice that had already helped build one of the greatest dynasties in sports history. Greg Popovich. And the relationship between Popovich and Wembanyama may be the most important piece of this entire story. Popovich's final masterpiece. Every Spurs dynasty begins with one standard. Greg Popovich. For decades, Popovich did not just coach basketball. He built culture. He created leaders. He taught stars how to handle pressure, criticism, sacrifice, and expectation. Now, many believe Victor Wembanyama may become his final masterpiece. From the moment Wemby arrived in San Antonio, Popovich was not trying to create a celebrity. He was trying to build a complete player, a complete teammate, a complete leader. That is why their relationship matters so much. Popovich gives Wembanyama the kind of honesty most young stars never hear. He challenges him, corrects him, and pushes him without protecting his ego. And Wemby does something rare. He listens. He accepts the criticism. He turns pressure into fuel. That trust is what makes this partnership powerful. Even when Popovich is not directly on the sideline, his influence is still everywhere. In the Spurs' culture, in the team's discipline, and in Wembanyama's maturity. You can see it in how Wemby handles questions, how he reacts after mistakes, how he stays calm when the expectations become overwhelming. That does not happen by accident. It comes from being shaped by people who understand championship pressure. Popovich, Duncan. The Spurs system, while fans focus on highlights, San Antonio is building something deeper. Habits, leadership, composure. A mindset strong enough to carry the next era of the franchise. And that is why Popovich's greatest coaching achievement may not only be the championships he already won. It may be preparing the player who could carry the Spurs into their next dynasty. But there is one thing even Popovich cannot teach: belief. And the confidence Wembanyama carries behind closed doors may be the most dangerous part of his entire story. The mentality that terrifies the NBA, condensed version. To the public, Victor Wembanyama looks calm, humble, and controlled. But inside NBA circles, that image only shows part of the story, because behind that quiet personality is a level of belief that separates good players from all-time greats. Not loud confidence, not social media hype, real conviction. Wembanyama doesn't just talk about success. He prepares as if it is already expected. Every workout, every practice, every lesson builds the same idea. He belongs at the highest level. That kind of mindset is rare in young superstars. Most players rely on validation from media, fans, or highlights. Wembanyama relies on preparation, and that difference is critical, because validation can disappear overnight. But mastery, built through discipline and repetition, stays permanent. Veterans around the league notice this immediately. They don't see a player chasing attention. They see a player chasing control over his own development. That's why expectations don't seem to affect him the way they affect others. The bigger the stage, the more focused he becomes. The louder the pressure, the calmer he appears. And that combination is what makes him so dangerous for the future of the NBA. Because while physical talent has limits, mindset does not grow at the same speed for everyone. If Wembanyama continues building this foundation, the gap between him and the rest of the league could become much wider than anyone expects. But what truly separates him isn't just basketball skill. It's the values he lives by when nobody is watching. And that's where the next part of the story begins. Why Wemby is different? Every era of the NBA produces star. Very few produce something more than that. Victor Wembanyama is beginning to fall into a different category. Not just a star, not just a franchise player, but a player people inside the league quietly describe as built differently. And it has nothing to do with height. It has everything to do with behavior. Because when most young superstars enter the league, the pattern is predictable. They celebrate early success. They embrace attention. They build brand identity first, basketball second. But Wembanyama appears to follow a completely different path. He avoids unnecessary noise. He avoids distractions that don't improve his game. He avoids anything that pulls focus away from development. Instead, he leans into structure, into discipline, into repetition. That approach is why veterans trust him more than most rising stars. They don't just see talent. They see control over habits, control over mindset, control over growth, and that is what the greats always had in common. Another key difference is how he handles learning. Most players at his level try to protect their image. They hesitate to look inexperienced. They avoid situations where they might fail publicly. Wembanyama does the opposite. He actively seeks difficult environments. He asks questions others are afraid to ask. He puts himself in situations where improvement is unavoidable. That type of mentality is rare at any age, but especially at 22, it also explains why so many legends are drawn to him. Because people who have already reached the top understand something important. You don't help players who want praise. You help players who want truth. And Wembanyama wants truth. That is why his development feels different. It's not just coaching. It's not just training. It's accumulation. Layer after layer of knowledge from players who have already mastered different parts of the game. Defense, footwork, decision-making, leadership, mental toughness, all being absorbed into one player at the same time. That's what makes this situation unique. He isn't just learning how to play basketball at an elite level. He is learning how to think like multiple generations of champions at once. And when you combine that with his physical tools, the outcome becomes unpredictable for the rest of the league. Because players like this don't follow normal development curve. They accelerate quietly, gradually, then suddenly, and that sudden moment is what every NBA team is trying to prepare for. But there is one final layer to this story, one final shift that could define everything that comes next for Victor Wembanyama, and it starts with the idea of legacy. Not just becoming great, but becoming the face of an entire era, the beginning of a new dynasty. Every great NBA story eventually reaches a moment where potential stops being speculation and becomes reality. For Victor Wembanyama, that moment feels closer than anyone in the league wants to admit. Because everything surrounding him now looks less like a typical development arc and more like the early formation of something historic. A structure, a system, a dynasty in motion. Tim Duncan's unexpected involvement was only the first signal. The growing respect from Spurs legends was the second. The continuous arrival of Hall of Fame mentors was the third. But the real shift is deeper than that. It's psychological. Wembanyama is no longer being treated like a promising young player. He is being treated like a long-term project worth investing in at the highest level of basketball intelligence. And that changes everything. Because when champions from different eras start aligning around one player, it creates a rare environment where growth is no longer accidental. It becomes engineered, intentional, accelerated. The same franchise that once built a dynasty around Tim Duncan now appears to be carefully shaping the next one around Wembanyama. And that is why comparisons to the past keep resurfacing. Not because history is repeating itself perfectly, but because the foundation feels familiar. Discipline, silence, work ethic, winning culture. San Antonio has always valued those traits above everything else. And Wembanyama seems to embody them in a modern form. But what makes this story even more significant is what it represents beyond basketball. It represents continuity, the passing of ideas, the transfer of mindset from one generation of champions to the next. That is something rare in modern sports. Because greatness is often fragmented now, players train separately. Systems change constantly. Cultures rarely survive long enough to be passed down intact. But in San Antonio, something different is happening. A bridge is being built between eras, and at the center of that bridge stands Victor Wembanyama, not as a finished product, but as the beginning of what could become the next defining chapter of NBA history. Of course, nothing is guaranteed. Injuries, pressure, expectations, and competition all still exist. The NBA never hands greatness to anyone. It has to be taken, earned, sustained. But if the patterns continue the way they are forming now, the league may be witnessing the early stages of something it hasn't seen in years. A true generational shift. Not just a superstar, not just a franchise player, but the foundation of an entire era. And that brings everything back to the original question. The same question Tim Duncan seemed to answer the moment he broke his silence. Is Victor Wembanyama already becoming the next face of the NBA? Or is the league only beginning to realize what has been in front of it all along? Either way, one thing is becoming clear. The future is no longer waiting. It has already arrived.